Hello and welcome. I am Frank, your host, and you can probably already tell you are listening to a very special episode of Empires of History podcast. We are doing something a little different today, but please rest assured the narrative story of the Ottomans will continue in normal fashion. I'd like to introduce you to somebody. His name is John McHugo, and he carries with him knowledge and wisdom about the Middle East I think you will find very fascinating. John McHugo pursued Islamic studies at Oxford University, where he graduated in 1973. He spent the next 2 years as a graduate fellow at the American University in Cairo, where he earned a Master of Arts in Islamic History. His time spent as a student wasn't all books and research, however, as John bore witness to actual living history in Egypt, as what we Americans would know as the Yom Kippur War or Ramadan War unfolded. John's guiding passion for history took him across the Middle East, where he traveled as far as Syria. Whereas most Western travelers would look to spot a hotel, John made it a point to spend his nights as a guest of the local people, proving that his insights into the history and politics of the Middle East are deeply personal on top of being supremely informative. In 1975, John returned to Oxford and made the decision to pursue a career in law. Between 1981 to 86, he worked for a London law firm, translating Omani legislation into English and resolving commercial litigation for the firm's clients. In 1995, John's hard work was rewarded when he was made full-time partner in his firm. At the age of 55 in 2006, John resolved to do what he could to make the Arab and Islamic world accessible to Westerners. There followed a period of publication of wonderful works to include A Concise History of the Arabs, Syria, A Recent History, and A Concise History of Sunnis and Shi'is. You can find more information about John McHugo and his works by visiting johnmchugo.com. You can see him in action by going to YouTube and checking out TRT's interview with John as well. And now, without further delay, I happily introduce John McHugo. Well, John, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Delighted to be with you, Frank.
When I was speaking to Elizabeth with your publisher, and she was telling me about you and telling me some of the interviews that you were on. And the first interview that I checked out was on Turkish TV.
Oh, yes.
Yes. And I was instantly hooked. I have never heard, well, being in America, we pretty much have CNN and Fox News, and that's about it.
Okay. I prefer CNN of those two.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Right there with you. But whenever I saw the interview, I thought this interview is only 6 minutes long. I would love to sit down and chat with John and see what else he has to say. So
excellent. So what would you like to cover? I mean, I haven't looked through your podcasts, but
okay.
You seem to be covering the earlier periods of the Ottoman Empire on the ones that you've got on that you've published so far.
Well, my ambition with the podcast is to start from the very beginning, as far as the podcast goes. So I started at about 1280, with the decline of the Seljuk Turks in Anatolia and the slow rise of the Turkish, the Beyliks, the arrival of the sons of Ottoman, and really my ambition is to take it all the way up to 1922 and 1923 when the Ottoman Empire was finally extinguished, I guess. So
okay,
it's a lofty ambition, and I'm definitely in it for the long haul. So
okay.
Yes, sir. And on that note, I have here that a couple of the books that you've published is A Concise History of the Arabs.
Yes.
And this is your latest work, is that correct?
My latest is A Concise History of Sunnis and Shi'is.
Okay, what can you tell us about your latest work, A Concise History of Sunnis and Shi'is? Because I'm really interested in that topic. So.
Okay, well, that came out with Georgetown University Press in the States back in April. The reason for writing that book was basically to dispel a certain view of Sunnis and Shi'is that has percolated into the general consciousness, particularly in the English-speaking world. And even some people who I respect, like Barack Obama, and I don't know if you know the columnist Thomas Friedman.
I've heard the name before.
Yeah. Well, his stuff varies. Sometimes I think he's good, sometimes I don't. I think he can be very bad, but that's not the point. The point is that people like this are thought of, they are not on the fanatical right. They are certainly not, you cannot call Barack Obama someone who hates Muslims or Islam, but they have maybe in a sort of intellectually lazy way, they have they've allowed to be encouraged the perception that there has always been this internecine sectarian strife in Islam, which is today the root cause of so many of the Middle East's problems. And I think that, I wouldn't even dignify it with an oversimplification. I think it's a question of a little knowledge being a dangerous thing. Obviously, there has been conflict between Sunnis and Shi'is very often, and it's increased exponentially over the last 2 or 3 decades. But the situation is actually rather different. And if we begin at the beginning, we tend to think of Sunnis and Shi'is, let's have a comparison. Now, as someone said, comparisons are invidious. They tend to mislead more than they enlighten. So, okay, let's have Catholics and Protestants. We understand that.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
But it's very, very different. If we think of a sect, a sect breaking off from a religion, that tends to be when some great religious scholar, a charismatic person, maybe someone who pays for his life for his beliefs, he dies, he is martyred, and his followers reformulate the faith. They think it's been restored to its ancient purity, and they very soon believe something that's incompatible with what had been the mainstream. And then you get a real religious split.
And I can certainly think of a few examples in the Western world of this happening many times over.
I can think of many, indeed. Yes. Well, it wasn't quite like that in Islam, you see. Basically, Islam is a religion based on the teaching of a prophet, Muhammad, who had his revelation, what he believed to be the word of God, revealed directly to him by the angel Gabriel. Fine. Those revelations were collected within 20 years of his death, probably. I mean, there are some scholars who dispute that slightly, but basically within the lifetime of people who knew the prophet, they had collated Islam's holy book. Right, that's all very clear. But the problem in Islam is the prophet died quite suddenly and doesn't seem to have foreseen his death or made any clear arrangements that were accepted by the whole community as to how Islam should be, what should be the teaching authority in Islam after his death, who should interpret the Quran, how should you fill in the gaps in the Quran, etc., etc. And it's more complicated too, because of course, in the case of Islam, the Prophet had also founded what we would now call a sovereign state. I describe it in my books as a polity, a little, what started off originally, well, you can't call it a city-state, but, in Medina, the Prophet had the Muslims followed him to Medina. There were indigenous Muslims in Medina. Gradually, most of the other people in the oasis converted. Some sincerely, some much less so, we know that. And of course, there is also the very difficult question of his relationship with the Jewish tribes who were exiled, or in one case, after they were considered to have betrayed him, the males were offered the alternatives of conversion to Islam or death, and most of them chose martyrdom. But anyway, you had this Muslim community that was led by him and by nobody else. Everyone looked up to the Prophet. Suddenly he falls ill. Within a couple of days, the illness is clearly very serious, and he dies possibly within a matter of hours, and only knowing a few hours before he actually finally lost consciousness that he was dying, perhaps. So it's a great, profound shock to the Muslim community. And
really quick, John, not to cut you off, but just for our listeners' sake, the time period of the Prophet Muhammad's death, we're talking about the 600 AD period, I suppose, or is this?
Yes, we're talking okay. The early 600s.
The early, the early 600s, and by the time of the Prophet's death, can you give us a little bit of background about what the world looked like? Like, I understand that you had the Eastern Roman Empire, but I know some of my listeners would probably be wondering about that.
Okay. Yeah. Well, the background, if you like, the geopolitical background at the time, and I'm only going to talk about the areas near Arabia.
Yes, sir.
But there were two, if you like, the two great powers, the two superpowers of the day were what we normally call the Byzantine Empire, or the Byzantine Empire, pronounced both ways, and which claimed to be the Roman Empire.
Okay.
By then, it was a Greek-speaking rather than a Latin-speaking empire, but they thought of themselves as Romans, Romaioi in Greek. And they were, of course, the Eastern Orthodox Church, was the state religion. And what is today the Hagia Sophia, in those days in Istanbul, then Constantinople, was then the greatest church in the world. By a very, very long way. And people really should go and marvel at the immense size of the dome that was built. So Byzantium was the great power of the day. But the other great power was Persia, or Iran. And the Persian Empire was not Christian, it was Zoroastrian, but the Zoroastrians don't seem to have been terribly concerned about whether their subjects converted to Zoroastrianism or not. But they, anyway, had a ferocious war with the Byzantines, with the result that the two empires were wearing themselves out. And that, if you like, was the geopolitical background. When Muhammad was born, well, we think in 570, but we can't be exactly sure of the date. It was around then. And he began his preaching more or less around the year 600. And, then within a few years, he wasn't getting anywhere in Mecca. He was rejected by the establishment of Mecca. They saw him as a threat to their way of life and to the very lucrative money they actually made out of the pilgrimage to the pagan gods whose statues were in and around the Kaaba, the shrine in the center of Mecca. So they rejected Muhammad, they persecuted his followers and him. He went to Medina after there was an invitation from the people in the oasis of Medina for him to come and settle the disputes between the tribes. And he arrived in Medina, he took on this role, and gradually, he was obviously an extremely charismatic figure. He was well known for his integrity, and he was trusted, and this, of course, helped him. And he had people who became Muslims were meant to put their loyalty to Islam first before all other loyalties. So over time, Medina became his stronghold. The people converted, some of them definitely with religious sincerity, genuine conversions. But as so often happens in history, once you have a leader and whose basis of his authority is religion, and people are following him, it becomes the sensible and practical thing to follow him, and there are rewards for doing so. That's basically what happened. Now, can I go back to his death?
Of course. Yes, sir. Please, by all means.
So Muhammad dies, and I'll tell you a very interesting story about his death, because there are two accounts. According to one account, the most widely one you will hear today, he died in the arms of Aisha, who was a much younger person. She was only a girl when they became engaged, and she was the daughter of one of his closest friends, a man called Abu Bakr. And she tells us that the Prophet died in her arms. But there is also another story, because the Prophet had a cousin called Abdullah bin Abbas. And incidentally, Abdullah bin Abbas would go on to be the great-great-grandfather of the Abbasid caliphs.
Yes,
you know, so if you like, he was a very close relative. And he says, and he was only a boy at the time, he says, no, in fact, the Prophet died in the arms of Ali. Now, Ali was the Prophet's other cousin from another branch of the family. So think of three branches: Ali's branch, Muhammad's branch, and Abbas's branch. And as was the custom, first cousin marriage was very popular in that society. And Ali had married the Prophet's daughter Fatima. And it was only through Ali and Fatima that the Prophet's bloodline continued. And in our own day, the Aga Khan claims to be a direct lineal descendant.
Oh, really?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
As does the King of Jordan, through a very different branch of the family. We're talking well over 30 generations ago,
Definitely.
But they can show you family trees to prove it. Anyway, the Prophet, there are these two rival accounts as to who it was who held and comforted the Prophet as he died. And as very often with stories in history, you don't say which one is true. It's more helpful, because it's very difficult to prove which is true. It's more helpful to say, why are there these two rival stories?
Exactly.
And what they show you is very deep family friction. Now, Aisha was the wife of the Prophet at the time of his death, who was definitely closer to him than any of the other wives. And she was the daughter of Abu Bakr, one of the Prophet's first friends and one of the earliest converts to Islam. And surprise, surprise, Abu Bakr ended up being the leader, the first caliph, as he was called, of the community after the Prophet's death.
Okay.
Not a bad choice. He showed himself to be a very effective political leader. Because he was close to the Prophet, everyone respected him as a political authority. But there are a few interesting things here. The first is that it took 6 months for Ali to accept that Abu Bakr was the leader. And he only accepted that Abu Bakr was the leader after his wife Fatima, who remember was the Prophet's daughter, had died. And when Fatima died, she was buried at night so that Abu Bakr could not attend the funeral. Now that is an extraordinary snub, if you think about it, to the leader of the Muslim community, who was one of the Prophet's oldest and most trusted friends. About that there is no doubt. Another little thing that's quite interesting, there was a kind of meeting after the Prophet's death, within hours of the death. Abu Bakr and another very early convert, Omar, who happened to succeed Abu Bakr when he died, came to a meeting of the Muslims of Medina, and it was at that meeting that it was decided that Abu Bakr would be the leader. Now, I don't want to go into that meeting because it's all very complicated, but one fact sticks out. Ali was not present. Now, Ali was 20 years younger than Omar and 30 years younger than Abu Bakr. Maybe he was too young. There were also very sound political reasons why he might not have been the leader. But why did they choose to have the meeting there without him being present? And what Ali was actually doing, as the Prophet's closest male relative at the time of his death, he was engaged in preparing the body for burial. So in a way, his absence from that meeting can be construed as showing his preeminence. If you are a Shi'i, basically, to skip a lot of early history, you believe that Ali was always intended, he and his descendants, who of course are also the descendants of Fatima, and therefore directly of the Prophet, to be the spiritual leaders, if you like, and that implied political leadership, while the whole of Islam was a single state. They were always meant to have a special religious authority. And why did Ali not fight for his rights? Well, there is a very good reason, they would say, because he put the interests of the community first, and he didn't want to cause strife. So he accepted that Abu Bakr took over the leadership after the death of the Prophet, and he accepted that Omar did after the death of Abu Bakr. After that, it becomes complicated, and this is a very fascinating story, but again, it's very lengthy. But by this stage, by the time of the death of Omar, the Muslims had burst out of the Arabian Peninsula. They were busy, they had conquered a lot of land from the Eastern Roman Empire, from the Byzantines, the whole of what we call Greater Syria and Egypt, and they'd conquered the Persians. They'd taken Iraq from the Persians, which was then their most important province in many ways, although it wasn't Persian speaking. And basically they were driving their way across the Iranian plateau. And so suddenly this relatively poor desert community with a tribal aristocracy, from which people like Abu Bakr and Omar came, of course, suddenly found itself transformed into an empire. Now, what happens when you suddenly become an empire like this? Read the history of what happened when tribes came into the Roman Empire and conquered a city, and and so on. They became wealthy. They had tribute paid to them. The Muslims behaved relatively well as conquerors, though not beyond reproach by any means. But not all their conquests were very nice. I mean, there were some massacres. Let's airbrush that from history. But they weren't interested in laying everything to waste in the way that, say, Genghis Khan was, or Timur-Lenk was. They thought, right, we've taken over this very nice area of Iraq, which is very fertile. Let's tax the land, and the tax will go back as tribute. Excuse me. This led to a civil war eventually, because the third caliph was killed. A man called Uthman was killed by mutineers, and it was only after that that Ali became caliph. He was chosen. Well, sorry, he wasn't chosen as caliph. He was convinced that he was the rightful successor. Of course, by this stage, he was a man, I don't know, probably in his 50s or something. He was the right age for leadership, and he was acclaimed in the mosque in Medina. But that, of course, wasn't quite the same as all the Muslim community agreeing on him. And he had an Achilles heel, which was that the people who were responsible for the death of the third caliph, Uthman, these mutineers, many of them were his closest and most devoted followers. So within a space of a few years, you have Ali, who seemed perhaps finally he had become caliph. Finally, if you like, if he had remained caliph and he'd been successful in his rule, maybe the split between Sunnis and Shi'is would never have happened. But the problem was the murder of Uthman meant that people who, although Ali was in no sense responsible for that murder, people who didn't want him to be the ruler, people who wanted to rule themselves, began to rebel. And surprise, surprise, the first rebellion was stirred up by no other person than Aisha. We know from history that Aisha and Ali hated each other. Anyway, Ali was able to deal with that rebellion.
Okay.
But then he found himself in a very difficult position, because the most powerful provincial governor was the very worldly wise governor of Greater Syria, a man called Muawiyah, who went on to found the Umayyad Caliphate, and who was a close kinsman of the murdered Caliph Uthman. And so Muawiyah refused to swear allegiance to Ali, and eventually Ali had no choice but to lead an army against him. Things were inconclusive. I'm trying to take out all unnecessary historical detail, but I do tell your readers it is a really fascinating story.
Is this story included in your book?
It's included in A Concise History of Sunnis and Shi'is, yes.
Okay.
But let me get to the crunch point, because then what happened was that Ali was assassinated. Not, incidentally, by a follower of his rival Muawiyah, but by a man from a group who had split off, saying, we used to be followers of Ali, but we think that Ali is really out for himself. They were a bit like an extreme Protestant grouping at the time of the Reformation, if I may use a Christian comparison, after saying I wouldn't use Christian comparisons. Because what they said was, the Muslim community should always elect its leader, and any male Muslim, they said, even an African slave could be the leader. Now, these are people known to histories as the Kharijis, haven't been very important throughout the history of Islam. Today, Oman is the only country that follows their version of Islam, and there are also a few of them in Algeria. But the point is that because they assassinated Ali, the whole empire fell into Muawiyah's hands. And you then find the story of the Umayyad Caliphate, the Abbasid Caliphate. All of this was this gradually became what we know today as Sunni Islam. The term only developed gradually because a Sunni literally means someone who follows the custom of the Prophet. And of course, Shi'is claim they follow the custom of the Prophet too. They just have slightly different sources as to how they find it. Now, You probably think I've contradicted myself, because I began this by saying that, in actual fact, the story between Sunnis and Shi'is has not always been bloody and violent. I've been telling you about how, in a way, it all began in blood and violence. But what happened over the centuries was that it was only gradually that a kind of doctrinal difference appeared. Do you look to Ali and the family of the Prophet for religious teaching, to interpret Islam, or do you look at the other companions of the Prophet? And of course, what had happened was that most of the companions had sided up on the other side against Ali. And so this was a very bitter struggle at the time. And it led to two rather divergent streams of interpretation, even if the interpretations came to be much the same in most things. You know, there are differences, for instance, in the ways Sunnis and Shi'is say the daily prayers, but from the point of view of a non-Muslim, they're absolutely very minor indeed. There have been, in Islamic history, there have been various Shi'i dynasties. The most famous would be the Fatimid Caliphate in Cairo, and which was an Ismaili dynasty. And then, of course, we have in the 16th century the conversion of predominantly Sunni Iran. Iran was predominantly Sunni up to that point. The fact that
really up until the 16th century, it was predominantly Sunni. Okay,
it was.
Wow.
And in the 16th century, beginning in the year 1500, a nice easy date to remember, the Safavids came along, and again, this is another fascinating story, and again, it's told in my book. They came along with the idea of, we need a state religion. They actually saw their follower as a kind, they saw themselves as the followers of a kind of Sufi sheikh with semi-divine status. And this Sufi sheikh probably thought, well, I can't have, if I'm going to rule over all these rich lands with all this nice bureaucracy that gathers in the tax revenues for me, and they are Sunni Muslims, they're never going to accept that I'm an incarnation of God or something. But if, on the other hand, I say I'm a descendant of a Shi'i imam, I'm related to the family of the Prophet, I'm a descendant of the Prophet through one of the imams, we can have a kind of compromise. And that worked. It was enforced from top down, but it basically worked. And that's how Iran became predominantly Shi'i. So you
John,
have had...
your telling of this story has, not to cut you off, but it has completely, in the past couple of minutes, changed my whole perspective on Persia. I mean, I used to think of it, as a Shia strong point, ever since time was recorded. But I had no idea that up until, it was a Sunni nation. And that's just completely kind of blown my mind right there. So,
well, I wouldn't quite go so far as to say it was a Sunni nation. Because it wasn't, well, Persian or Iranian culture goes back a very long way before Islam.
Very distinct, of course.
And it's completely distinct from Arabic culture. It's linguistically, it's Indo-European rather than Semitic. There are all sorts of things that are different about if you like it, Iran or Persia is basically a civilization, put it that way.
I like that way of putting it. Yeah, that the paradigm of thinking about it gives it some fluidity.
Yeah, and the other thing is that Persia or Iran was the first country conquered by the Arabs, conquered by the Muslims in the 7th century, which re-emerged. If you notice that the Arabic-speaking world now includes the whole of, there are tiny linguistic minorities in Iraq, in Syria, You also got one big one, by the way, I shouldn't neglect, the Kurds. But,
Exactly.
in Egypt, almost everyone speaks Arabic now. In Libya, almost everyone speaks Arabic. And that's despite the fact that a lot of people in Egypt have always stayed Christian, and as they have in Syria and Iraq. But in Persia, the Persian language re-emerged, now written in the Arabic alphabet, with loads of Arabic words, and very modified from pre-Islamic Persian. And there was a very rich Persian culture, from the 9th, 10th centuries onwards as this emerged. Now, I'm not trying to say there weren't Shi'i Persians before the Safavids, but in a way, this is one of the points I tried to make in the book. The sectarian divide that we see wasn't necessarily so significant. And you can think of loads and loads of cases in Islamic history where Sunnis and Shi'is overlapped, blended, merged. I'll give you a very good example. The Imam is the term used by Shi'is for the leader of the family of Ali in their own generation.
Okay.
The 6th Imam was a man called Ja'far as-Sadiq. Sadiq meaning the sincere, the truthful. And not only was he the Shi'i Imam, but he was a huge scholar of Islamic law, of the Sharia, very, very widely respected. And 2 of his students, Malik bin Anas and Abu Hanifa, who came and sat at his feet and who respected him and whom he respected, became the founders of 2 of the largest and best known Sunni Muslim law schools. And they see the 6th Shi'i Imam, Ja'far as-Sadiq, as a figure to be respected. I'll give you another example. You've probably heard of, in modern Iran, in the Islamic Republic of Iran, you've probably heard of the supreme mujtahid and the idea of a mujtahid and of ijtihad. Do those words mean anything to you?
Unfortunately, I have to portray my ignorance on the subject, so I am definitely open to some enlightenment.
Okay. Well, basically, ijtihad is the process of what a lawyer would call judicial reasoning within Shi'i Islam. And Ayatollah Khomeini, when he basically became the supreme guardian, his idea was that he was the supreme interpreter of the religious law in the absence of the Imam.
Okay.
And because for the Shias of Iran, for the 12 Shias as they're called, the Imam is in hiding and will only come back into and be known to us in their own version of the end times, basically. Until then, the scholars of the law, the mujtahids, are the people who can interpret the Sharia, the sacred law of Islam. But this idea of ijtihad and the mujtahid was something that the 12 Shias, like the Iranians, took from Sunni Muslim scholars. And not only did they take it from Sunni Muslim scholars, but they had no problem acknowledging this. So you see, the differences are sometimes much less clear-cut than you would think. And then in modern times, of course, we're aware of the friction, the conflict between Sunnis and Shias. But a lot of it is stirred up by geopolitics, by struggles for hegemony between Saudi Arabia and Iran in particular. And we don't remember, for instance, that, say, in the 1914-18 war, when the British army, largely composed of Indian troops, landed at Basra at the foot of the Persian Gulf, initially to defend the oil fields there, but they soon decided to push their way up to Baghdad. Now, what we now call Iraq and was then the three Ottoman provinces of Basra, Baghdad, and Mosul. Those provinces then, as now, had a majority Shi'i population. Something like 60% of the population was Shi'i. The Ottomans, who were Sunnis, managed to rally the Shi'i tribes to their cause. And there was a major battle at the end of 1914 in which they very nearly pushed the British back. They failed to do so. And then, as is the way with tribal people, they then sort of rather gave up. But the important point is that the Sunni Ottomans managed to get the Shi'i Iraqi tribes to fight on their behalf. And then at the end of the war, when Britain initially had ideas of turning Iraq into a colony, the Sunnis and the Shi'is in Baghdad combined together to oppose this, to agitate against it. So you see, Sunnis and Shi'is, the division, it's not always as clear-cut as it seems. And if I may just finish this little disquisition about Sunnis and Shi'is, because my voice is getting rather tired, and I'm still recovering from that cold I told you about.
I perfectly understand.
But one place that, of course, there is a big conflict in today is Yemen. And we often hear about how in Yemen, it's the Saudis and other Gulf Arab states, Sunni countries supporting the Yemeni government, and you have Iran supporting this other group called the Houthi movement. Mm-hmm. Now, who are the Houthis? Now, it happens that Yemen is 2/3 Sunni and about 1/3 Shi'i. But the Shias in Yemen are not the same at all as the Shi'is in Iraq and Iran. And the Shi'is in Yemen are what are called Zaidi Shi'is, who are much, much, much closer to the Sunnis. But because they are nevertheless Shi'is, there has been a little bit of sectarian colouring given to this conflict. But in actual fact, because the Saudis see themselves as the hammer of Iranian influence anywhere, and they see the Iranians as trying to get anyone who's a Shi'i to rise up against Saudi hegemony. Now, there has been a bit of that, but historically in Yemen, whether people are Zaidi Shi'i or Sunni has made absolutely no difference. And if you go back to the 1960s, when they had another civil war in Yemen between the royalists and the republicans, now these were the days before we thought of the world in the geopolitical terms of today. We thought of it much more in the terms of the Cold War between communists, Marxists on the one hand, and free market and conservative
capitalist West.
Capitalist and the West. Now, surprise, surprise, President Nasser of Egypt, of socialist Egypt, was the one backing the rebels. Was the one backing the Republicans, who were nationalist, socialist Arabs. But the people backing the royalists were the Saudis. And the last royalist ruler, in fact, all the royalist rulers were Shi'is. They were Zaidi Shi'is. And they were the people the Saudis were backing, as were the British and Americans, by the way, but that's irrelevant to the point I'm making. The point is, the Saudis in those days were perfectly happy to back a Shi'i ruler. And this Yemen was a tribal society, and when you have a civil war in a tribal society, as we know from Afghanistan, tribes change sides. They suddenly have a peace agreement with their bitterest enemy, or suddenly there's something that goes wrong and they suddenly start fighting their closest friends who become their new enemies. And in all of that, in Yemen, sectarianism has been irrelevant. It doesn't matter whether people are Sunnis and Shi'is. Now, I just thought I'd tell you that story to end this little podcast.
Okay, I was about to say that sounds like a Very good offensive, realist assessment of the Middle East, especially the last part. So that wraps up my first interview with John McHugo. As you can probably tell, our discussion was cut a bit short. John was getting over a bad cold when we were talking, and I decided to give the man a break. I really enjoyed my conversation with John, and I hope you did too. Please send any feedback to empiresofhistorypodcast@gmail.com. And please don't forget to check out John's fine books and the links on the website and in this episode. Thanks very much for listening.